Okay, good evening. Welcome to the User Experience Speaker Series at Metropolitan State University. My name is Chuan Zhou, and I'm a professor and the director of the Design of User Experience Graduate Certificate Program. Tonight, we will hear from Sangam, Napit about demystifying user experience through human-centered design. Sangam is a senior UX researcher at Amazon in its transportation and logistics business. He has a demonstrated history of leading in multiple industries such as energy, retail, and banking. He's skilled in breaking down enterprise silos through UX research, organizational psychology, design thinking, and team building. He is a self-published author and a member of the Minneapolis City of Lakes Rotary Club. Please join me in welcoming Sangam Napit.
All right. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me over to give this talk about demystifying UX. Really appreciate your time and the hospitality. Once again, my name is Sangam Napit, and I am a senior UX researcher. And sorry, some of the text is covered here, but a senior UX researcher at Amazon in their middle mile business. So middle mile is, I'm sure you've seen those semis on the road hauling all your packages. That's the business that I support. And in the past, I've worked at Best Buy, US Bank, and then ExxonMobil. So various industries, but in all places that I worked, I've always implemented human-centered design. Some of you may know it as human factors and ergonomics. And of course, there's just different branches of UX. But my entire career has been spending time understanding user needs and making sure that we build products to help our users, to help our customers and meet those sort of demands. So today I'm going to be talking about UX in general and human-centered design principles. I'll keep it super informal. We have a nice small group here. Looks like there's a few folks joining in, but I want to keep it super informal. There's a couple of fun exercises throughout the presentation. So we'll use chat to kind of, do a little bit of sort of interactive exercises. And then at the end, I'll have some time for questions and happy to answer those specifically towards the end. So without any further ado, let's jump right into it. I've kind of tried to break this presentation into different segments here, and we'll start with three main topics before we sort of move on. And I've called them, I'm presenting them in terms of a menu. So we'll start off with our first course. It's a multi-course meal, which hopefully is appropriate for the time of the day. But first of all, I just want to talk about why UX is important. And the idea of where it comes from. It's not a new idea, as many of you probably already know, and just touch on a couple of standards very quickly. Before I dive in, I just wanted to share a very interesting story. This is something I learned a while back. I guess in the 1950s, there was a interesting problem in California. They didn't have enough people to harvest tomatoes. So what they ended up doing is building a machine to do the harvesting for them. Unfortunately, the machines would crush these, ripe, round tomatoes. It was difficult to process. So there was a UC Davis, I believe he was a professor, that was hired to redesign the tomato, if you can believe it, instead of redesigning machines or finding a different solution. So Jack Hanna was his name, and he designed what is now known as the square tomato. And the square tomato was designed to handle the machines and prevent from getting crushed, so they could get processed more quickly and feed the, at the time, growing fast food nation. So instead of, thinking about the system and the tool and the product, this is a great example of how, the solution was applied to the wrong side of the equation. And you'll hear me talk about that quite a bit today. We'll talk about, UX is all about the human machine interface, right? So there's two sides of the equation. One side, we have humans, which is us. The other side, we have the machines, the tools we use. A lot of times we think about the tools we use and, whether or not they work properly, is the functionality correct? But we always forget about the human that's part of the entire loop and the entire system. The humans never is not considered as part of the entire system. And that's something that needs to change. And that's something UX attempts to change, right? When you sit down in industry, when typically UX works with product and tech. And when you sit down with, we call them the three legs to the stool, that's something that UX is constantly pushing for. How do we design products to fit people and not people to fit products? And you probably have seen this image. This is image of Graham. This was built. This is not a real person, of course, but this is an example of what a person would need to look like to survive a car crash. This is a sculpture built by what's equivalent to the Department of Transportation in Australia to demonstrate how people are not designed to survive car crash. So there's all around their campaign of using seatbelts. But this is also another great example of how, we people are designed with a certain set of capabilities and limitations. And it's much easier to think about that ahead of time when you're building a product and try to make sure your product fits your customer, your user, instead of expecting the user to fit your product. And that theme will come up time and again. This idea of the human not being part of the entire system, the first time I read about it was in this Herbert Simon book, Science of Artificial, it's called. Simon identified the complexity in human behavior as a reflection of primarily the outer environment. And he believed that the behaviors we see when people use specific products, whether they're physical products or digital products, is actually a reflection of the product design itself. So if a person is struggling to use a product, most likely it's because of the design and the limitations of the product, not the person's inability to use that product or solution that's available to them. A couple other folks I want to touch on in this space. Mike Cooley, if you're familiar with UX, he's probably one of the first people to introduce the idea of human-centered systems. And here he talks about the same thing, right? When we're developing systems, developing products, we don't really tend to think about the human nature before we think about the machines. We're thinking about, oh, we built this amazing machine, right? But we don't think about human as part of that system. And thinking about discussions that are happening today, right? AI is a big discussion happening today. And a lot of times we think about how amazing AI is and what capabilities machine learning has. But a big component of that is the human piece, right? When you're interacting, for instance, with ChatGPT, to take a great example, if without your input, ChatGPT is nothing, right? It's just a data storage device, right? It's because of our input, our interaction with it is what makes it so amazing in terms of a tool to use. So there's a lot of folks that have put this idea out there about how important it is to think about the human as part of the entire system. Another great person to know in the industry is David Kelly from IDEO. IDEO is a design consulting company based out of San Francisco. I believe they worked with Apple early on to design Apple's first mouse. But if you've heard of design thinking, the concept of design thinking, understanding the problem first, framing it, ideating through solutions, testing, prototyping, testing, before actually deploying it, that the whole design thinking process comes from IDEO, which is all rooted in human-centered design. Another person, of course, many of you probably know Don Norman. If you've done usability testing, the Nielsen Norman group, and if you've done any UX research, that group is very famous. If you're new to UX research, anytime you need to Google something related to that, you can type in Nielsen Norman and type in whatever you're trying to search related to the topic. I'm sure they have something on it. So that's a great resource if you don't know about it. The Nielsen nngroup.com, I believe, is the website, but you can just Google Nielsen Norman. And that's the company that Don Norman started. He actually was, I believe, a researcher and a psychologist, usually usability consultant early on. And he's got a lot of great papers on usability, of course, and applying human-centered principles to digital products and services. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about human factors and ergonomics in the same vein as UX. Human factors is just UX in the 1950s, if you will. It's been around for a long time. There's ISO standards, International Organization of Standards. So human factors has its own sort of category, and you can search it. I've got a little image here of the standard itself, and that's something you can download and read more in detail. But there are standards around the application of human-centered design. So the point being that, this is not a new concept, and there are standards associated with this as well. A lot of folks aren't familiar with them if they're new to the discipline, but I just wanted to give the quick intro. Now I wanted to just touch on the history and some important figures, and then how this kind of got some traction in industry, if you will. But the idea of human-centered design, the idea of UX itself is not new. You can find examples of this in ancient Greece. This image is taken from a report from the National Technical University of Athens. These are bench seats designed in ancient Greece in their theaters. And you'll see here the curvature at the front. And that's design. That's by design. That curvature is by design on purpose. And the idea was that inward curve would fit the lower shape of the leg. And that was the reason they kind of designed it that way, is because, these shows, the older Greek shows lasted a few hours, and to keep, avoiding the restless leg syndrome, they designed it so you could tuck your legs underneath and shake them if you wanted. And because these seatings did not have hand rests, and if you wanted to get up, the idea was that by placing your legs and feet underneath you, you'd have a better control of your center of gravity, and it's easier to get up. So again, this is a great example of stage seating, right? Designed to fit the needs of the performance attendees. So this can be seen in ancient Greece. A great example of this, if you're wondering, it's UX around us. It's around us everywhere. The reason a hammer looks like a hammer because, we have hands, all the tools, right? It's sometimes difficult to relate to UX for folks that are new to the discipline because it's in the digital space. And because it's in the digital space, we have opportunities to improve the design so we don't get it right off the bat, and that's okay, right? The cost of getting something incorrect is not as high as, for instance, think about when you build a bridge. If you don't get that bridge built correctly the first time, that's not a good situation. But it's a little different on the digital side because, we get to kind of improve on it. And that's, the whole UX research discipline is all about ensuring that we're iterating and learning and improve the designs of our tools. But if you're wondering, is there UX around us? 100%. Just look at your tools. This is a great example of an ancient drum. It's a two-sided drum. If we had more than two arms, more than two hands, we probably would have had a multi-sided drum, right? Because the drum would then have been designed to fit that type of makeup of a human. But that's not the case. We have two hands, two arms, and you'll see the products designed to fit those. Two of my favorite, and you'll see these folks, but two of my personal favorites in the human factor space, the UX space, Frank and Lillian Gilbert. Lillian, by the way, interesting, first female engineer to earn her PhD. She was a psychologist, but also had a PhD in engineering. But her and her husband, Frank, they developed motion studies as part of improving engineering management. And you'll see this picture that Frank is holding here. This is actually motion in time. He built a sculpture, a wire or a thread with this motion in time captured, and it was a 3D capture of motion in time. And the idea was that by reducing the amount of bends and curves, you would improve the efficiency of a job But they are one of the early folks that talked about, how important it is to think about the end user, right? So you're not adding a lot of fatigue. The idea was that if it was an efficient system or a process, that would cause a lot of fatigue for the human, and a lot of fatigue would lead to human error. And so they were all about reducing human error. So a lot of great work in the early 1900s. As always, a lot of times great ideas don't get adopted right away. A lot of times as humans, we're very reactionary, and it's not until an accident or incident that we adopt a better way of doing things. This is an Aloha flight, I believe, from 1988. As you can see, part of its fuselage is missing. It went through a lot of pressure changes. There were some maintenance issues. Those maintenance issues did not get captured early on, and this flight lost part of its fuselage in midair. There was one fatality. It was a flight attendant, but all the passengers were miraculously saved, and they were able to land the plane. But one of the sort of early adopters of human factors, human-centered design, was the aviation industry, and it was because of incidents like this. And so a lot of sort of UX in the physical space. You'll see a lot of great papers coming out of the aviation industry because of incidents like this, which is unfortunate, but we learn from that, and we try to build better products for people. I love this schematic. This is from the Handbook of Human Factors. This goes to what I was talking about earlier related to the human-machine interface. Everything we'll talk about today, you can sort of put this in the back of your mind as we kind of work through, right? The two sides of the equation, as I mentioned, there's just the machine, the system, if you will, and then the operator, the human, and UX lives in wherever that interaction is. It doesn't matter how the system changes, right? The system could be just the tool, like a hammer. The system could be an online application. The system could be AI. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, a lot of times when things are built by humans, it's often for a human sort of purpose. It's a tool. And as we're thinking about using the tool, that's really important for us to think about the operator subsystem. A lot of times, like when you look at the point of the schematic is that when you look at a machine, you see, okay, there's a display, there's controls. How do we make sure we're putting the right information on the display? Do we have the right number of controls? Are those controls, can people physically reach those controls, right? But we often don't think about the human part of that, like how are people designed? How do people perceive information? How do they process it? How do they make decisions? Having all that information handy and knowing that information is super valuable when you're trying to build something that's a product that's much better than if you did not consider those pieces. So with that, I'm going to jump into sort of how people are designed. That's what the main focus is. Of course, as UX, the discipline itself is all about thinking about how people are designed and taking those considerations into product design. And we have a couple of exercises here too. But let's talk about the design of differences. This is an interesting story that was reported by Todd Rose, and there's a TED talk that he gave related to this, and his idea was, and by the way, Ted Rose is he's considered a high school dropout turned Harvard faculty. So he's done some interesting work. But he gave a TED talk a while back, I think, where he talked about there's no such thing as an average human. And this is the example that he gave. And again, so around the 1950s, I think the U.S. Air Force had a big problem. There were there's a lot of incidents, a lot of planes were crashing, even in training. And they were losing a lot of pilots. So they hired Lieutenant Gilbert Daniels. He was a statistician to figure out what's going on with these planes and why are they crashing. And because they wanted to prevent these, especially because they were happening in training, they wanted to prevent these unnecessary deaths of their pilots. So Lieutenant Daniels kind of looked at the aircraft, and he realized that there was something interesting. Airplane cockpits hadn't changed since the 30s, really, going into the 50s. But what he did notice was that the size of people were changing. In the 20s and 30s, pilots were smaller, leaner, and by the 1950s, pilots were a little bit bigger, more muscular. And he said, "Oh, you know what? Maybe it's the change in the physical anthropometry of the pilots that's leading to these incidents and injuries. So he said, you know what, if I could design the average cockpit, we might be able to eliminate these accidents and injuries. So what he did is he took like different measurements, measurements from the elbow to the wrist to the fingertip, and he identified that there were 17 or so really important dimensions that need to be considered to design the average cockpit. So he took those dimensions, redesigned the cockpit to fit the average pilot of the 1950s, and then he tested it to see, hey, is this going to work? And found out that almost nobody fit in that average cockpit. And so the point of this story by Todd Rose was like, there's no such thing as an average human. So when you're trying to design a product, you can't say, oh, what does the average person's need? And that's a design principle that we sort of live by in industry is, you try to design for the extreme, not the mainstream, because if you try to design for everybody, it ends up not really working for anyone. And a great example of this is, so this is a graph developed by the FAA to show, for instance, like the normal distribution here so men and women in height, right? This is something when I worked at ExxonMobil, we used quite a bit, for instance. So at ExxonMobil, I worked as a human factors engineer. We worked on building offshore platforms, for instance, and as you can imagine, right, on an offshore platform, space is very critical. There's not a lot of space anyways to do much of anything. So we had to figure out, how do you optimize the space that you have? And so, designing how big the hallway should be, how wide should it be, how tall should it be, is a big factor. And so, if we were trying to design let's just come up with something as simple as a doorway. How tall should a doorway be? If we try to design for the average person, what ends up happening is, like, if you design like here, let's put the average male. Let's just take that for an example, right? If you design for the average male, then you have 50% of the rest of the male population who might be taller than the average, so-called average person, would not properly fit through that doorway. So something we try, like I said, we try to design for is the extremes, 5% and 95%. So if you're trying to design a doorway and you said, you know what, if you make the height of the doorway to fit the 95th percentile male, then anybody that's shorter than that person would be able to fit. And a lot of times we also had to figure out, okay, when we place a safety critical valve is, a valve that controls, let's say, the flow of fuel, right? And if you have a fire somewhere at a pump, a critical valve would let you shut down the fuel so it's not constantly fueling that fire, so you can put that fire out, right? But where would you place that valve? That would be a type of question that we would ask in the engineering world. Well, if you said that if the 5th percentile female, knowing what we know about height, distances of arm length and things like that, if the 5th percentile female can access that critical valve, then anybody that's taller than that person could also access that valve. So this is the main point here, again, is to show that, when we're trying to design, it's better to design for the extremes and not the mainstream. So it's a great graph to keep in mind as you think about building better products for your users. Give you some examples of physical capabilities here. We're thinking about, a lot of times at least in my space, we looked at static posture, repetition, right? So things that might cause injury and how to prevent those. And of course, in the UX space, we're thinking about cognitive capabilities. And so what are people capable of, doing from a cognitive standpoint? Like, what are you capable of doing, and what are your limitations? We'll touch on some of those. A great example here is that humans are terrible at estimating probabilities, and I'll show you a great example of how that is. But knowing that knowledge, right? If you know that people are not really good at estimating probabilities, then when you're designing something, you can design something to avoid that. Say, okay, how do we reduce guesswork that's required by our end user? That's a big thing to consider when we're designing a product that really fits our end user. And to take this, and you know what, let me actually stop my recording here real quickly because this is blocking a lot of stuff here. So bear with me for 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to end this recording. Bear with me, folks. Sorry about that because it's blocking a lot of my stuff. Give me a second. Almost there. I did mention it was going to be informal, so hopefully that's all right. Okay. All right, I'm going to enter full screen mode and then share my screen again. So now you should not. All right. All right, we'll jump to the screen that we're at. All right, this is better. Good. All right, so we're talking about how humans are terrible at estimating probabilities. All right, to see a great example of this. This is a fun exercise. You probably have seen this if you're in math or in business, or if you've studied behavioral economics, you probably have seen this before. But here's an interesting problem. Let's assume Bill is 34 years old. He's intelligent but unimaginative, compulsive, and generally lifeless. In school, he was strong in mathematics, but weak in social studies and humanities. Which is more probable? Bill is an accountant, or Bill is an accountant that plays chess? If people want to take a guess and drop, feel free to drop your answers in the chat. And you're probably seeing the chat now too, but that's all right. Oh man, we have some very smart people here. That's correct. It is 1. Does anyone know why it's not 2? You want to drop an answer? That's very correct. This is the first time I've gotten the right answer, by the way, and I've given this presentation to many different social skills. I love that. That's funny. Yeah, this is just a basic probability. I'm going to shut the chat here. Basic probability issue, right? So when you have an and, that means you're adding another condition here. So whenever you add another condition, the chances of that being true are less likely, right? So it's more likely that Bill is an accountant. Why? Because the sample size for that population is going to be much larger than Bill is an accountant and plays chess. So when you ever encounter people that like predicting the future, if they say this is going to happen and this is going to happen and this is going to happen, you know that it's, they don't know what they're talking about, because as soon as you put an and, your sample size of that, decreases, and the likelihood of that occurring also decreases. So great example. All right, here's a fun exercise. All right. So we're gonna do an activity here, and I'm gonna give you 5 minutes, okay? And what I'm gonna do, no cheating, of course. There's no way for me to verify, so we'll do the honor system here. But we're gonna spend 5 minutes, and I want you to either type or write down as many states as you can remember. The goal is to do 50 states in 5 minutes, but whatever is easiest for you. Either write it down or type it up, and I'm going to start the time, and we're going to spend 5 minutes coming up with as many states as we can, and we'll report back on how many we got, okay? So I'm going to start the timer right now. All right, time is up. All right, put your pens down or stop typing, and I'll look over the chat here, and put in the chat how many states you got. Let's see the numbers. Oh, some folks put it in the chat. That's fine. Yeah. Let's see, 39, 46. Nice. 42, 49. Oof. What is that one elusive state? 42, 47, 41. This is an impressive group. This is, again, the first group that's more folks above 40. Yeah. So as you can, everyone can look at the chat here, right? If we built a histogram of all these numbers, it's skewed to to more numbers above 40. Typically, of course, it'd be a normal distribution. That's what I've seen, at least in the past. But forgot to count Minnesota. I love it. That's happened to me and I got 60. I love it. We need to acquire 10 more states. I think Sean is suggesting. I like it. The point being, all right. So it's the reason people in the past, when I've done this, there are folks that get all 50 states, and it's okay if you did not. But the reason they end up getting it is because they still remember the song that was taught in grade school. And here's a quick map of the US. How many of these states would you have gotten if this map was available to you? And as anyone can imagine, probably more than the number you had now. And if you had, above 40 states, it would have been much easier to get the last 10 states, for instance, if you had a map. The point of this exercise is that people are not good at recalling information. So anytime we build, especially as a UX researcher, myself, or in the UX space, when we're building digital products, this is something that we try to keep in mind, right? People are not good at remembering things. Very good at recognizing, and I'll touch on that just in a little bit, but we're not good at recalling information. So what does that mean for design? So for instance, the two-step authentication, when that was first designed and first built out, I would argue that was not user-friendly, and it wasn't designed with that knowledge that people have a difficult time recalling information, because when two-step authentication first came out, you had to remember the numbers. And unless you're really good at remembering numbers and typing that in, that was not a good process, right? Yeah, all of us can remember. But now, as you know, they've improved it. For instance, you don't actually have to remember the number, because your keyboard will remember it if you're on a mobile device. Excuse me. Your mobile device will remember that number, and you just have to touch it, and it automatically enters it for you, right? That's a great improvement on the two-step authentication. But you can see that in designs today, where we don't think about the human, we don't think about that left side of the schematic, how people are designed, and we build products and expect people to use those products. So later on, once you're done with school and where you're working, in industry, keep these things in mind, because the more, of course, we know about how people are designed, and the more we include it early on, the better it is for the products we build. So those are some of the key takeaways there, that people are designed with a certain set of capabilities and limitations, and knowing that information is very important. And to be able to use that information early on in the design process, especially in the UX design process when you're building digital products, is very important. Next, let's talk about some of those the design of people and those limitations and capabilities I've talked about. We all know systems have incredible capabilities, and we have robots to build everything these days, right? So they have a certain set of capabilities, but they also have a certain set of limitations, right? When you look at a traffic light, the traffic light is designed to present 3 different lights, right? It cannot present to you more than what it's designed for. And same with human beings, right? We all have a certain set of capabilities. We all have a certain set of limitations, and knowing that information is very powerful when we're trying to build products that are user friendly. So we can do more than what we think about. I don't know why my image is not showing up on this one. Let's take a look here real quickly. I don't know what's going on. There's a picture here, human capabilities, but it's not showing. Oh, here it goes. There it loads. Yeah. So when I say humans are capable of doing things, we're always capable of doing more than we think, right? So I do want to keep that in mind. And we know that, like, human potential, right? There's a lot we're capable of doing. And there's a group actually in Thailand, a tribe that supposedly can actually see underwater, because, they've been doing that for multiple generations, and their eyes have adapted for that, right? So when we talk about capabilities, know that we all have different sets of capabilities. It doesn't mean there's a limit or there's a ceiling, right? We have world's strongest men and women that can do incredible things. Doesn't mean that humans are not capable of doing that. But for the purpose of our talk today, the important part is to know that there's a set, right? There's a set of what we can and can't do, and knowing that information is very valuable when we're building products. And we also have limitations. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So Here's a sentence you probably have seen. This will circulate around the internet a while back and was a famous line, but how many F's do you see in this sentence? I'll go back to the chat here and drop your answers in the chat. So we have 2, 3. Sorry, I'm probably blocking you if you're still reading. All right, I see some 7. Whoa. Yeah, the correct answer is 6. And the folks that missed the 6 different one, can anyone share why? What were the 6? The folks that saw the 6, there's a couple ones that are repeated. Yeah, that's right. OF of. And if you've seen this before, you probably also knew the answer. But if you didn't, if it's the first time you're seeing this, right? Turns out we're not, when we read sentences, we see OF so often. We just kind of skip it. And there's a theory out that says because it's of OV and not OF, we tend to miss that as well. So fun little exercise here about, we're looking at something, right? You're actually looking at this and we still miss it. So that's a great example of limitations of vision. It's not your fault, right? This is intended for us to make a mistake, right? But to highlight the importance of understanding that, hey, we're designed with a certain set of capabilities and certain set of limitations, and knowing that information is very important for product design. Let's see, we're going to next talk about the human information processing model, and all that is, and if you've taken human factors courses or taken some psychology courses, this should sound familiar. We're going to be talking about the left-hand side here. We'll start with perception, then talk about decision making, and a little bit about the action responses. So something very interesting to learn about structure: the peripheral vision is very poor. That's what that just means is like a lot of our high definition vision is centered at a very small concentration area. If you stick your arm out and then look at your thumb and you see your thumbnail, that is the size of your primary vision. So anything outside of the size of your thumb that you're looking at is considered your periphery and your secondary vision. So what does that mean? That means you need to be directly looking at something to observe it. So if you weren't directly looking at the letter O and then the letter F, the word of, the most likely you missed that letter F, right? So, and that's okay. That's just the way the vision is designed, right? The fovea, 1% of the visual field is at the center and it's high resolution. A lot of times when I do usability tests, I don't know if anyone here has done a usability test, sometimes you'll sit and you'll see participants struggle to find a button, right? Or find out how to move to the next step of the workflow. And you just sit behind, a two-way mirror or whatever your lab setup is. And you say, oh, can't you see that button? It's right there. And a lot of times folks don't see it. It's because the way the primary vision is designed. And structure is also very important. Is the brain receiving the right information, right? Which side is up, which side is down? This photo's rotated. It's pretty impressive what this guy's doing here, but structure is very important. And that structure provides context for us. So something to keep in mind as we're building. In the chat here, how many, right, drop your answers in the chat. How many triangles do you see? I selected 8, 4, 8. Excellent. Any other guesses? 5, 2. All right. How many triangles are actually there? 0. That's correct. So there's no triangles there, right? But all of us saw anywhere between 2 to 8, I think it was. Why? Because our vision, the way our brain is designed, it's designed to create shortcuts. It's designed to fill in gaps when information isn't there. This is from a book that's highlighted in the book is called Designing with a Mind in Mind. It's a great book, by the way. I highly suggest grabbing that book if you are interested in going into the UX field. There's a lot of great insights into how people are designed. And this image comes from Jeff's book. I think this is the Caniza triangle, though. I think it was developed by an Italian psychologist. So he's not the first person to use this triangle, but great example of how our vision is not perfect. Our brain fills in the information. When there's no incomplete information, we kind of decide that there's information there. So a great example of limitation. What do you see in this picture, if anything? Oops, I think it pauses when I go. Dog drinking. I love it. Great job, Nick. A dog. Yeah. It's funny is when you say there's a dog, you cannot unsee it, right? Once the dog is there, you can't really unsee the dog. Dog sniffing. Yep, that's it. We see what we expect, and it's if you can show this same image to your friends, and if you say, "Hey, do you see a dog sniffing there?" The likelihood that they'll spot it is pretty much immediate because you've told them what to see, and if you tell them what to see, they will expect to see it. And here's a great example of that. Sorry, I went backwards. Perception. Oh, actually, I have another really fun example of human limitation before I talk about expectations here. You can read this out loud to yourself and then read this one. And I know we're not in a room, but typically I have folks that I'm presenting this to read this out loud, and people will say, "Oh, fold napkins, polish silverware, wash dishes." And then I'll ask them to read the second sentence. They'll say French napkins, polished silverware, German dishes. And is it polished silverware or is it Polish silverware? And hopefully you said Polish silverware because that's the right answer. And that's the right answer because of the context that we're providing, right? The same word means something different when it's surrounded by specific context. So when we're designing products, this is something we think about as well. What context are we presenting the information? And that helps us understand whether or not it makes sense to our users. Perception is biased for our goals. Okay, this is the example that I was talking about. Okay, I'm going to show you. It's going to be a toolbox filled with a bunch of tools. It's going to be a cartoon image, and I'm going to show it to you for, less than a second, okay? And what I want you to do is tell me whether or not there is a green pair of scissors in this toolbox. All right, ready? Here we go. All right, did you find the green pair of scissors? And if you did, if it was there, I don't know if it was there or not, but if it was there, where was it located? And yes, okay. A lot of folks saying yes. Where was it located? Center. Okay, good. Yeah, that's the right answer. It was in the middle. Now, I'm not going to go back to the image, but was there a screwdriver in that toolbox? Oh, Christian, with a yes. I saw nothing else. Exactly. All right, Tessa. Yes. Okay. Where was so I think we have Nick was no, I'm not sure. Yes. Christian was the one that said left side. A hammer too. Nice. All right. So the correct answer is, let me go back. Oops. There is a screwdriver here, which is on the left-hand side, as correctly stated. Whoever got that right clearly was not following directions because, they anticipated that I was going to ask more than I originally intended. Because, yeah, that's correct. For folks that didn't see it, that's okay, right? Again, the way visual acuity works, the concentration is high at the center, and you have to be directly looking at something to be able to see it. And I told you what to expect, which is a green pair of scissors. And if that's what you're only hunting for, that's normally what you would have seen, right? Unless, I don't know of anybody whose visual acuity is greater than the size of the thumbnail at arm's length away. But if you do have that kind of visual acuity, that's very impressive. But for the most part, you have to be directly looking at something to see it. So point being, perception is highly influenced by our experience, current context, and then, of course, our goals. And knowing that information really helps us build better products at the end of the day. So what does this mean for design? Here's an example of Robinhood. I don't know if anybody uses Robinhood. This is just some screenshots zoomed in. That's why it's cut off on the sides here. But you'll see here, it says introducing stock lending. Congrats, you have access to passive income opportunity. Except when you click on that, it says, oh, program is not available, right? So you are kind of setting up the expectation and then failing to meet it. Very poor design. And we'll see that even today, like in products that are out there for us to use, still, fall short of good design. So key takeaways here: perception, a certain set of capabilities. Again, we have a certain set of limitations, and knowing that information ahead of time is extremely valuable when we're building a specific product. So clearly, Robinhood could definitely, and I don't know, this is a few months old, or maybe even a year old, actually. So they have updated their program here so that, if it's not available, there's no need to say congrats. Now you can do this, right? You just don't need to present it. But I think maybe if you click on it, that program is available now. Hopefully they've overcome that design issue. So all right, next, real quickly, let's talk about, check on time here. We're doing good. I'm trying to go to 8, a little past 8, and then open it up for questions here. But so we'll go through the next few slides fairly quickly. We'll talk about mental models, memory, and cognitive limitations. What are mental models? Mental models are just what we think, how we think the world should work. Often they're based on experience. They're typically incomplete information. But knowing what the mental model is for your end user is super important, because that helps you leverage what they already know and include that in your design. And that's a big part of UX research. As a UX researcher, something I spend a lot of time doing is when I do research with our customers. And of course, research is done in different phases, especially in the discovery phase. What I'm trying to do is understand what our customers' mental models are. And our customers are different, right? Sometimes we deal with, when I say we, this is Amazon's middle mile space. Sometimes we deal with drivers. Sometimes we deal with carriers, the owners of a driving, of a semi company. Sometimes we deal with sellers that sell on Amazon. And each of those people have different mental models. So when I'm building a product for a specific customer type, it's very important for me to sit down and understand what those mental models are. And you can extract those mental models from interviews, for instance, one-on-one interviews, from contextual inquiry, by actually going to their place of business and spending time with them, watching them do their job, watching them complete a task, asking them where the pain points are in completing that task, asking them what their unmet needs are. A lot of times, and ask them what their expectations are, right? Maybe, ask them what the current process is like and why they expect something to be a certain way. If something is manual today, that's a great time. That just means, we have an opportunity to build a digital solution for something that's very manual today. But that's a place where we try to understand what the mental models are and bring that mental model, the knowledge of that mental model over to the design, because that means we can build a product that leverages how people expect it to behave. Do folks recognize this pattern here? Should be pretty straightforward for this very smart group here, right? This is just a set of odd numbers here, right? What about this? Do folks recognize this pattern? Again, feel free to drop your answer in the chat. Oh my goodness, everyone is way too smart. Yeah, so for the most part, yep. First, it may not seem like pattern, but as you rearrange the numbers, it should look more familiar. And I should have not expected anything less from this group, because this group is very smart. But yeah, those are a set of numbers. And oftentimes when I share this deck, I have to tell people, yeah, if you're not from a 612 area code, you probably wouldn't even recognize this as a number. But the way we present information, right? We talked about this earlier. Context matters, structure matters, right? So the mental model here for a phone number is 3 numbers, then 4 numbers, right? You don't necessarily have to have the dash or the parentheses, but we all have a mental model of what a phone number should look like. So, and we can take that information, and a lot of times when you're filling out a form, that information is already built in. Good forms at least do that, right? You don't have to type in anything but the numbers, and it'll auto adjust it for you. That's a great example of design that takes into knowledge about how people's mental models about how a phone number should be listed. I mean, no one puts in the phone number like this, right? This doesn't even look like a phone number. So just to kind of illustrate that example there. Memory limitations. Memory is strongly tied to attention, right? So we tend to remember things we're paying attention to. If we're not paying attention to it, it's hard to remember it. And then, of course, a lot of psychology students probably know more about short-term and long-term memory, right? We won't go into those details here, but this is an image of a poster in the UK So if you were walking by this, what would you notice here? Some folks say, oh, the Dracula, maybe the knives. And supposedly this is the picture, same picture at night. I don't know if it's actually real or not, but this is supposedly the picture at night. And then the shape of the shadow that the knives cast looks like a monster. So that's pretty impressive, right? So if you see this, very memorable advertising. If you end up going to the show, that's a great example of how the advertising actually worked. But this is why people talk about making things that are actually memorable and that people pay attention to, or unusual, or things that stand out a little bit, right? Because that's what you end up paying attention to, and that's what you remember. Because maybe on a weekend you're saying, oh, what show should we go to? Oh, I remember seeing that board. It was kind of crazy. It had a monster on it that was that was casted by a shadow. So and whatever the case may be, right? Just a great example. Awareness test, we won't go into this, but here's the YouTube link, and I'll share it at the end here actually. Oops, let me go back here. You've probably seen this is the test that was put out, and it's on YouTube. You can actually just type in awareness test and pull it up, and the person that's leading this test will tell you what to do and say, hey, can you spot this? And the goal is to see how many for instance, how many passes. There's a team, a white team and a black team passing a basketball, and you're supposed to count the number of passes they make. So I highly encourage you to check this out. I'll put the link to the YouTube video after the presentation. You can check this out on your own, but we won't spend time on it today. For the psychology students, you're probably familiar with this term, salient cues. It was a term developed to demonstrate that what humans pay attention to. These are a bunch of coins here. Does anyone know what the real penny looks like? Any guesses? I'll pull up the chat here. H, okay. G. A lot of times when I show this, people say, do people even use pennies anymore? And yeah, that's very true, right? Yeah, the correct answer is A, and you can verify this if you want to go grab a penny real quickly, but the correct answer is A. The reason we don't get this right is because we only pay attention to what matters to us. And in the case of the penny, the size and the color is what matters. The details don't really matter to us that much because we don't use those details, right? So if you got it wrong, totally okay. When we build things, if we expect people to use it a certain way and they don't, it's not because they're not capable of using it. It's because whatever we built does not work for them. For some reason, it doesn't match the mental model, or maybe it doesn't match the cues that they pay attention to or that they've practiced to pay attention to. And so we shouldn't be surprised when people are not using our products. Decision-making. So Jeff Johnson talks about this, our thought cycle. He says we follow a general pattern. You typically form a goal. We choose and execute actions to make progress towards a goal, and then we evaluate whether or not those actions worked. So that's a pattern that we follow day in and day out. If you know this information, again, you can utilize this during design. This is a great book that talks about limitations. I like this a lot by Daniel Gilbert. He talks about this in this book, how we're overconfident in predicting outcomes. As we saw, we're not good at predicting outcomes at all. But I like what he says in this book. He says we rehearse success so often that we can't even imagine failure. And that's why one of the reasons we are very bad at estimating outcomes. But this is a great example. This book is also a good read on human limitations. Sheena Iyengar, she's a researcher at Stanford, done some incredible work. You can see her paper, you can see her talk, on YouTube and read her papers. She did the infamous JAM study. You probably, again, psych students or UX students, you probably have heard of this. She set up a station at a fancy grocery store near Stanford University. And what she did is she had 24 different, she started out by having 24 different samples of jam that people could come and taste. What she noticed is when she had 24 of these jams out, more people came and stopped and sampled it, but not as many people bought. But when she had only 6 different types of jams, less people came to to the table, but more people actually bought jams. So this is a great example of analysis, paralysis by analysis, where you have too many choices and it's hard for you to make a decision. I think we've all seen that, right? And this is a great example of why you might wonder, when you are trying to get a credit card or when you're trying to get a new Verizon plan, they'll show you 3 options, right? There's a reason. That's by design. If they showed you a lot of options, it'd be more difficult for you or for us to choose from that. But when there's 3, there's a nice comparison, and you hopefully, and even those 3, they even take it a step further to kind of nudge you towards getting a plan that they want you to get, right? So all of that is by design, and it's taking advantage of the knowledge that we have about how people are designed and building that into how solutions are offered to you. So keep that in mind. This is an interesting one related to representativeness. What causes more deaths? So this is in a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Dan Kahneman. It's out of UC Berkeley, also a great book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It talk about how thinking works with 2 systems, system 1, system 2 thinking. Highly encourage you to take a look at that. But we don't no need to answer it here, but it's interesting when Dan did his research, what this showed is essentially whatever you whatever the most recent knowledge is, or if you read about something, or if something recently had happened to you or a family member, that's the one that you would lean more towards, right? So for instance, if you have a family member that's diabetic, under accidents in diabetes, you're more likely to say that more deaths are caused by diabetes. It's only because that's the representation that you have. And there's been actual research done around this, and these are the correct answers, right? You're 20 times more, the cause of death is 20 times higher for asthma folks than tornadoes, right? Which probably makes sense because there's not as many tornadoes, and there's not many tornadoes that or places that people live in that have tornadoes, but we probably think it's tornadoes if, let's say you live in Kansas, your answer might be tornadoes because that's a representation, the most recent representation you have. So again, knowing this information of what people expect based on the experience they've had, very important, very good to leverage during design. Another example related to overestimating, repeated exposure, emotional experience, sticky messaging. The emotional experience, Dan gives a great example of this. He talks about, I think it was himself, he was going home one day and he saw a car at the side of the road that had caught on fire, and then so when you go down that same road in the future, you expect, oh, am I going to see another car here that's caught on fire? You kind of expect to do that just because it happened once and it was such an emotional experience that you just kind of expect it to happen again and again, just because it had a sort of it created a specific reaction in you. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen, right? But we expect it to happen. So I love this experiment related to anchoring. This is a fun, Dan O'Reilly conducted this experiment. He's got a great book called Predictably Irrational. I think he's come under fire recently for some of his papers. So, all those politics aside, this experiment's interesting. What he had his class do was write down the last 2 numbers of their social security, right? And not share it with anyone, just had them write it down. And then after that, he said, oh, okay, so, how much would you estimate this wine to be? And then, how much would you estimate those box of chocolates to be, right? And so interesting find was that people whose the last 2 social numbers of the social security were high, like in the 80s and 90s, estimated these products to be more expensive. And so if you were in the teens, like let's say last 2 of your social security numbers, 11, 12, 13, 14, they estimated the prices for these products to be much lower. And that was and his reasoning being the anchoring effect. You'll anchor on the information that you just recently had to estimate what the likelihood, even though, you're not actually, if you drink this wine, of course, you know how much it costs, but if you don't, then you're going to estimate it to be based on whatever number you anchored on most recently. So key takeaways here, a lot of key takeaways related to how we process information, how we make decisions, related to memory and attention, right? All of that, again, certain set of capabilities and limitations built around that. and knowing that information is very valuable as we go into designing products. So now real quickly, let me touch on the product development life cycle. You probably have seen this already. So typically we divide the product life cycle into 4 phases: discovery, design, development, and deployment. And as a UX researcher, I'm sort of embedded in each phase of the product development life cycle. In the discover phase, I'm spending a lot of time with our users, doing a lot of we call discovery work, a lot of interviews, contextual inquiry, job shadowing. During the pandemic, a lot of this was virtual. Now it's in person, but all we're trying to do is go understand how the process works today, to figure out, again, to learn those mental models, to understand the context of the business, because we want to take all that information and then embed it into the design. And typically I'll sit down with all of our customers, gather a bunch of insights, put it to a report together, and then I'll share it with our designers. And our designers take that information and actually create mock-ups, prototypes, and I go out again and I test those prototypes because when I sit down, right, in discovery, when I sit down with someone and I share that with the designer, whatever the designer creates is only a guess, right? A guess or a perception of what we think the solution should be. Doesn't mean it's necessarily the right solution. That's why, as a researcher, I have to take that again and test it with our users, preferably with a new set of users. You can use some of the same users you did in discovery, but it's preferred that the more you show this to a different population, the more, the better feedback you get, because it's more exposure, right? But we need to show those designs, and we do usability testing on those designs to say, hey, this is what we thought the solution should be. Tell us whether or not we got it right. And the whole idea is to test multiple times, iterate multiple times, build a prototype before we hand it to dev. And the idea is that by the time our programmers take those designs, that's been tested multiple times, low cost, prototype mode, right? And they don't have to do a lot, because like changing code costs a lot of money, and making changes later in the product development life cycle is very costly, right? So we want to catch those sort of errors early on, iterate on them, and then before we hand it to our developers. And then once our programmers build it out, we launch it into the wild. That research continues to happen, because after that we want to spend time with our users and say, okay, how is this behaving in the wild, right? Because when we do our interviews, when we do our usability testing, they're all like, set up in a specific environment. Usability testing is, typically done in a non-natural environment. If we can, we try to do it in a natural setting. It's very difficult to do, but we're trying to capture, anything that doesn't work early on. But even so, we don't catch everything. And once we deploy it, the idea is that we're reducing the risk with every interaction we have with our customers, and by the time we deploy it into market, hopefully that risk is minimum. But we still do surveys at this point, and collect feedback from our customers, and try to make the product better. So thinking about the product lifecycle in 4 phases, as a researcher embedded in each phase, and as a researcher, my goal is to ensure that I'm a constant advocate for the end user, and I'm bringing in all the insights I know about the user and making sure it makes it into the end product, whatever it is that we end up delivering. All right. With that, let's see. Yeah, we're a little past 8 here. So that's all I have for tonight. I'd love to open it up to questions. And yeah, thank you so much for kind of sitting through this presentation. Hopefully it was helpful and enlightening in some way. And you have some idea of sort of how things work in industry. And I'd be happy to answer any other questions folks have.
Well, thank you, Sangam, for a fantastic presentation full of interesting examples. So I would like to open this floor immediately to our audience. Any questions or comments, you can put that in Q&A, or you can just put that in chat. Or if you have questions about Sangam's actual work, his experience on Amazon, this is a great opportunity to ask.
Yeah, and feel free to come on camera or just drop a question in the chat as well. Happy to answer anything. A lot of times, yeah, go ahead, please.
I just figured I'd ask. So I have a graphic design background, and I'm just looking to learn more about UX. And I kind of have just been thinking I'll just mess around and find out. But just like, obviously there's so many resources out there. I mean, if there was just like a simple, sort of just getting started, like what you might recommend.
Yeah, we often get quite a few folks with the graphic design background, and actually that's a very good background to have, especially if you want to become a UX designer. A lot of times people get mixed between UX and UI design. UX, some UXers, user experience designers, do UI design, but they're not what we call visual designers. But if you have a graphic design background, I guarantee you know all the pixel sizes and pixel colors, right? You have a very keen eye for that. And if you want to get into UI design, that's you're already ahead of the curve. So, but anything you want to learn about UX, the Nielsen Norman, and let me try to see if I can grab some resources right off the bat. And I'm happy to send more resources later on as well. But the Nielsen Norman group, like I shared before, that's a great place to learn anything and everything UX. And here, I got this right here. And of course, the courses that the university provides are probably a great place to learn more. But this is a great website. Like, this is typically, like, any UX person that you talk to typically knows about the Nielsen Norman group, and they will have stuff like, you can type in like how to start a career in UX. What does a UXer do? Day in the life of the UXer, training, the research reports, and like templates, even like presentation research report templates, what kind of research to do depending on what product phase, what phase of the product life cycle you're in, how to get an internship, all of that stuff. This is a great website, and I highly recommend starting there. Of course, there's many more, but of course, when you're doing your research, be as specific as you can in terms of what you're trying to understand. And you might be just trying to understand what the UX, what a day in a UXer looks like, UX person's life looks like. Type that in Google, and there will be so much information out there, right? But keep in mind, again, like if you're into visual design, you can say, what is the day in life of for a visual designer? If you're into UX research, type that in specifically, or just UX design as well. So it just depends on what you're interested in as well. And yeah, the books I mentioned earlier all are great. So Predictably Irrational is really good. That's sort of behavioral economics. Thinking Fast and Slow is really good because it talks about how we process information and how we consume it, and yeah. So then Jeff Johnson's book, Designing with the Mind in Mind. That's also a great book. So if you like reading books, those are probably a couple of the best ones. Oh, here's another one. Hold on. Actually, this is my Bible, by the way. It's called let me see if I can. Designing for the Digital Age by Kim Goodwin. Look how thick this book is. This talks about the entire sort of UX design process. She is awesome, by the way. I was super lucky. I actually took a training class from her back in 2012 or something, 2013. It's been a while. But that's probably where I learned most of my stuff. And I constantly reference this book. It is great. So in terms of learning more about UX, I think those are some great places to start.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. Thanks for being the brave one and asking the first question. It's awesome.
Yeah,
In the Q&A,
right, let's see.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
In the Q&A, we have a question from Aisha Sheriff. Can you talk about specific projects you have worked on?
Yeah. So let's see. Let me go back to like Doesn't matter which industry. I'll start with the bank one, and then if you want to learn more, happy to share more. So at the bank, I was working with the small business group. So working on building. So US Bank has not been historically digital first. So when I joined them in 2018, I was there from 2018 to 2020. They were working on digitizing a lot of stuff. So one of the products I worked on there was bringing the loan application online. So historically, if you're a small business and wanted a bank loan, you would have to go to a branch office and apply, make sure you had the right documentation, right certifications, right proof that your business is a legitimate business. And so we brought that entire experience online. So you could do that from the comfort of your home. And one of the early stories we heard related to that was there was a couple that were in business together. The husband, very busy, but the wife needed to apply for an equipment loan right away because one of the equipment's broke, needed the money ASAP, but she was bedridden at the time. She had some health issues. And she said, "Oh my gosh, thank you for creating a digital version of your application process," because she was able to do that from the comfort of her home, from her couch. So that was one product we worked on, digitizing the loan application process. So at Best Buy, I worked on a internal tool for employees to manage their time. So, and they were at the time, we're also working on the ability to do sharing between stores. So like if you worked at the Egan store, you could, and for some reason, if you wanted to travel to a different store, like in Bloomington, and work at a Best Buy in Bloomington, you'd be able to do that. And we would track your time, an hour, and your time off for you. And then, as I mentioned, for Amazon, a lot of the products I work on technology for drivers. So the folks that drive trucks, the semi trucks, we have an app inside there that tells the drivers where to go to pick up the loads, where to drop the load. There's a navigation app. So those are some examples of the specific products that I've worked on.
Thank you. We have a question in chat. I'm a UX designer, and a common problem I run into a lot is not having enough time for research. How do you recommend designing for that limitation?
Yeah, I love it. This is a very mature UX question, and we get this quite a bit. Yeah, so this just tells me that the organization either you work for, or whether if this is I don't know if it's an internship or actual job, but like doesn't really understand the value of UX, and of course definitely doesn't understand the value of UX research, which is not new. Sometimes even at places like Amazon, you have to do some UX advocacy. So that happens even in big tech companies as well. So know that this is a common challenge. So typically, hopefully you're doing some sort of, you're spending some sort of time, right? Typically what I hear, at least nowadays I hear, it's like they don't have time for discovery. So like, okay, just build us some mocks and then let's do a usability test. If that's happening, if you're at least getting to do usability tests, you can insert some discovery questions, like to understand what the mental models are, to understand what the goals are for your end user in those usability tests. So you can kind of hide discovery type questions in usability testing. If you can't do any research at all, what I would recommend is once a product launches, like saying, well, let's at least do a survey. Let's see what people say about our product. And it's very rare, right, that the product knocks it out of the park right off the bat, especially without any research. So what you can do is say, okay, based on the feedback we're getting on the surveys of this product, we're saying maybe, your CSAT scores, your customer satisfaction scores aren't that great. And say, hey guys, maybe, let's spend some time doing some research early on so we understand what the customers need and include that in our design so we, can build a good product from the get-go, right? So you have to do a little bit of sort of say, okay, well, we built this, it didn't quite work. Let's go back to the drawing board for the next time we work on something. So, and another way to do is what you could do if you do have time, like in terms of proving a point, is like share research that's been done by other companies. And you can just, search for case studies that are out there for bigger companies, for instance. Like you can do it for Shopify. I don't know if any of Amazon stuff is public, but there's a lot of public case studies out there for that demonstrate the power of UX research that you could share with your stakeholders as well. So, but at the end of the day, you have to prove that that research is somehow informing you and helping you build a better product. And typically stakeholders care about making money, right? Or reducing costs. So if you're able to show how your research either helped reduce costs or, increased engagement or whatever the metrics are that your stakeholders care about, that's a good way to get them to spend some time and resources on research.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Any other questions?
I love I'm just going through the chat here. I love all the interaction here. So thank you so much. I know sometimes, this late in the evening, it can be hard to, have energy and be interactive, but I love that everyone was very highly engaged. This is a great group. Really, really enjoyed spending time with you this evening.
Your last chance. Any other questions? Well, hearing none, and in the interest of time, I'd like to thank our speaker, Sangam Napit, again for this fascinating talk. And thank you all for attending our events.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
If you could share with me your slides, I could share with the audience as well.
Oh yeah, sure. We can get you a copy for sure. Cool. Thanks everyone. All right. Take care.
Thank you. Have a good night.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.